Hello, this is Shmuel Moshe, and you are listening to the Weekly Parashahcast Season 2, the show where I read the Tanakh and provide my own interpretations of what I think it all means. This week's episode falls during the Shabbat for Parashat Pekudei on the 29th of Adar, 5785, March 29th, 2025. We're going to be reading from the book of Samuel, that's the book Shmuel, chapter 16 through 18, and continuing right where we left off. As always, you can follow along in English via Chabad.org. I want to remind everybody also that I am not a professional Torah or Scripture scholar, just somebody who wanted to study the Scripture. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on in. Shmuel chapter 16, verse 1. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Until when are you mourning for Saul, when I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and come, I shall send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have seen for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How shall I go? For if Saul hears, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "You shall take a heifer with you, and you shall say, I have come to slaughter a sacrifice to the Lord. And you shall invite Jesse to the sacrificial feast, and I shall let you know what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me whom I shall tell you." And Samuel did that which the Lord had spoken. And he came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the city hurried toward him. And one said, "Is your coming peaceable?" And he said, "Peaceable. I have come to slaughter a sacrifice to the Lord. Prepare yourselves, and you shall come with me to the sacrificial feast." And he prepared Jesse and his sons, and invited them to the sacrificial feast. And it was that when they came and saw Eliab, that he said, "Surely before the Lord is his anointed." And the Lord said to Samuel, "Look not upon his appearance, or the height of his stature, for I have rejected him, for it is not as man sees, what is visible to the eyes, while the Lord sees into the heart." And Jesse called to Abinadab, and he presented him before Samuel. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." And Jesse presented Shammah, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." And Jesse presented his 7 sons before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Are these all the young men?" And he said, "The youngest still remains, and behold, he is tending the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we shall not sit down until he comes here." And he sent and brought him, and he was ruddy, with beautiful eyes and handsome appearance. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." And Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And a spirit of the Lord passed over David from that day forth, and Samuel arose and went to Ramah. And the spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord frightened him. And Saul's servants said to him, "Behold now, an evil spirit of God is frightening you. Let our Lord say, Your servants are before you, let them seek a man who knows how to play on the harp, and it will be that when the evil spirit of God is upon you, he will play with his hand, and it will be good for you." And Saul said to his servants, "Provide me now with a man who plays well, and you shall bring him to me." And one of the young men answered and said, "Behold, I saw a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who knows how to play, a mighty man of valor, and a warrior, and prudent in affairs, and a handsome man, and the Lord is with him." And Saul sent messengers to Jesse, and he said, "Send me David your son, who is with the sheep." And Jesse took a donkey laden with bread, and an earthenware jug of wine, and a kid, and he sent them with David his son to Saul. And David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him very much, and he was his weapon-bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David stand before me now, for he has found favor in my eyes." And it would be that when the Spirit of God was upon Saul, that David would take the harp and would play with his hand, and Saul would be relieved, and it would be good for him, the spirit of evil would depart from him. End of chapter 16. So let's quickly recap what's going on here. At the beginning of the chapter, it says that Samuel is mourning for Saul, right? So he's been mourning him because of his falling from glory and grace. And God basically says to him, when are you going to stop crying about that? Now listen, I've picked out my new king. It's someone who is the son of Jesse of Bethlehem. So go and find him. And Samuel says, well, I can't do that. If I go and Saul finds out, he's going to kill me. And so God tells him, what you're going to do is you're going to say that you're going to make a sacrifice, and nobody's going to question that. And so he does as he's instructed, and he meets with the elders of Bethlehem, and eventually invites Jesse to join in as well. And one by one, Jesse shows off all of his different sons to Samuel. And the first son he sees is Eliab. And he says, surely this is the one, right? That's what he thinks to himself. But then God tells him, no, that's not the one. Don't look at outward appearances. The one I've chosen is on the inside, special, his heart. So he goes one by one through all the different sons, and behold, none of them are the chosen one. Finally, he asks, are all of your sons here? And he's like, oh no, we're missing one actually. He's out tending to the flock. And he's like, well, bring him in here then. Get him in here. And so David comes in, and as soon as he arrives, he's beautiful in appearance. In this moment, it's understood. God tells Samuel, that's the one, that's the guy. So Samuel anoints him with the oil in front of everybody. And it says, a spirit of the Lord passed over David from that day forth. So in doing this, the spirit of the Lord was upon David. It was like a transfer that the spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. So it's almost like it went from Saul to David. And instead, Saul was left with an evil spirit from the Lord. So I do want to bring attention to two things. First off, David being the youngest of his brothers. I mean, this does make me think of things like Benjamin, being the young lad that he was, and so on. But also, the youngest would not typically be the one that you associate. But here he has the heart, and that's what matters. Additionally, we think once again of people like Gideon, who he had the heart, even though he was from a small family. So it's not always going to be the hulking warrior that stands out. Now, with that being said and covered, I want to draw attention to the evil spirit of God, right? Because here we see something you don't see. An evil spirit of God is frightening you. So what this tells us is really important from an esoteric standpoint, that evil spirits, they too serve God. Everything is under God. Or at least in this case, this evil spirit was sent by God. So it's certainly worth noting that nothing happens in the universe without God's say-so, and as we'll find out, this really all happens to serve his new king, which follows with the servants suggesting that he get somebody who can play on the harp, and that's going to make him feel better. If he can hear the music of the harp, it will help make the spirit of evil go away. And so ultimately, one of them says, well, I know a guy. His name is David. He's the son of Jesse. This is the guy. And so they bring him in, and Jesse sends his son along with offerings of bread, earthenware jug of wine, and a goat, right? So, earth and water is kind of like the old traditional offering deal when somebody conquers a nation. But here we see that he sends David along with gifts to the king. It shows the sort of relationship they have with their king. I mean, certainly he must honor the king. So this is a very understandable practice. Nevertheless, it says that David stood before Saul, and Saul loved him very much, and he was his weapon bearer. So he basically immediately found favor in Saul's eyes, and he even says that expressly to Jesse. He says the message, David has found favor in my eyes. And so whenever that evil spirit was like haunting Saul, David would play the music, and it would make Saul feel better. And this is, of course, helping build up David's entire personage around the king. Now moving on to chapter 7, verse 1. And the Philistines assembled their camps to war, and they assembled at Socho, which belonged to Judah. And they encamped between Socho and Azekah in Ephes Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel assembled, and they encamped in the valley of the Terebinth, and they set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines were standing on the mountain from there, and Israel was standing on the mountain from here, and the valley was between them. And the champion emerged from the Philistines' camp, named Goliath, from Gath. His height was 6 cubits and a span. And a helmet of copper was on his head, and he was wearing a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of copper. And the greaves of copper were on his legs, and a copper javelin was between his shoulders. And the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spearhead was 600 shekels of iron, and the shield-bearer went before him. And he stood and called to the array of Israel, and he said to them,
Why should you come out to wage war? Am I not the Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose for yourselves a man, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, we shall be slaves to you. And if I overcome him and kill him, you shall be slaves to us and serve us."
And the Philistine said,
"I taunt the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, and let us fight together."
And Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, and they were panic-stricken and very much afraid. And David was the son of his Ephrathite man from Bethlehem of Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons. And the man was old in Saul's time, coming among men. And Jesse's 3 eldest sons who had followed Saul went to war. And the names of his 3 sons who went to war were Eliab the firstborn, and the second to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. Now David went to and fro from Saul, to tend his father's sheep in Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening, and presented himself 40 days. And Jesse said to David his son, "Take now your brothers an ephah of this parched corn and 10 loaves of this bread, and rush them to the camp, to your brothers. And you shall bring these 10 cheeses to the captain of the 1,000, and you shall see how your brothers are faring, and you shall take the tidings of their welfare." And Saul and they, and all the men of Israel in the valley of the Terebinth, were at war with the Philistines. And David arose early in the morning, and he left the sheep with a keeper. And he carried off and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the barricade, and the army which was going out to the battle array shouted in the battle. And the Israelites and the Philistines put the battle in array, army against army. And David left the baggage in the hand of the keeper of the baggage, and he ran to the battle array, and he came and greeted his brothers. And while he was speaking with them, behold, the champion named Goliath the Philistine from Gath was coming up from the ranks of the Philistines, and he spoke the same words as before, and David heard. And all the men of Israel, upon seeing the man, fled from before him, and were exceedingly frightened. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who is coming up? For he is coming up to taunt Israel. And it will be that the man who will kill him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and he will give him his daughter, and he will make his father's house free in Israel." And David said to the men who were standing before him, saying, "What shall be done to the man who slays that Philistine, and takes away reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should taunt the ranks of the living God?" And the people said to him, "So shall be done to the man who slays him." And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's wrath was kindled against David. And he said, "Why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the desert? I know your impetuousness and the evil in your heart, for you have come down in order to see the war." And David said, "What have I done now? Is it not but a word?" And he turned around from him toward another, and he spoke according to the same manner. The people answered according to the former manner. And the words which David had spoken were heard, and they related them before Saul, and he took him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your bondsman will go and battle with the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are unable to go to this Philistine to battle with him, for you are a lad, and he is a warrior since his youth." And David said to Saul, "Your bondsman was a shepherd of sheep for his father. And there came a lion and also a bear, and carried off a lamb from the flock. And I went out after him and smote him, and saved it from its mouth. And he rose upon me, and I took hold of his jaw, and I smote him and slew him. Both the lion and the bear has your bondsman slain, and the uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he taunted the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will save me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." And Saul dressed David with his garments, and he placed a copper helmet on his head, and he dressed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword over his garments, and he did not want to go in them, for he was not accustomed. And David said to Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I am not accustomed." And David took them off. And he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth pebbles from the brook, and he placed them in the shepherd's bag, which he had, and in the sack, and his slingshot was in his hand. And he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine was continuously drawing nearer to David, and the man who bore the shield was before him. And the Philistine looked and saw David, and he despised him, for he was a youth and ruddy, with an attractive appearance. And the Philistine said to David,
Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?
And the Philistine cursed David by his God. And the Philistine said to David,
Come to me, and I shall give your flesh to the fowl of the air and the cattle of the field.
And David said to the Philistine, You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, and I come to you with the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, which you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I shall slay you, and take off your head, and I shall give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines this day to the fowl of the air, and to the beasts of the earth, and all the earth shall know that Israel has a God. And all this assembly shall know that not with sword and javelin does the Lord save, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will deliver you into our hand. And it was, when the Philistine arose and drew closer to David, that David hastened and ran to the battle array, toward the Philistine. And David stretched his hand into the bag, and took a stone therefrom, and slung it, and he hit the Philistine in his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. And David overpowered the Philistine with the slingshot and with the stone, and he smote the Philistine and slew him, and no sword was in David's hand. And David ran and stood up to the Philistine, and he took his sword and drew it from its sheath, and he slew him, and with it severed his head. And the Philistines saw that their hero had died, and they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted, and pursued the Philistines until you come into the valley, and until the gates of Ekron. And the slain of the Philistines fell on the road of the Sharim, and up to Gath, and up to Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from pursuing the Philistines, and plundered their camps. And David took the head of the Philistine, and brought it to Jerusalem, and his weapons he put in his tent. And when Saul saw David going out toward the Philistine, he said to Abner, the general of his army,
Whose son is this youth, Abner?
And Abner said, By your life, O king, I know not. And the king said,
You ask whose son this youth is.
And as David returned from slaying the Philistine, Abner called him, and brought him before Saul, and the Philistine's head was in his hand. And Saul said to him,
Whose son are you, young man?
And David said, The son of your bondsman, Jesse the Bethlehemite. End of chapter 17. So let's recap this long story of David and Goliath, the iconic tale. So here we find out that the Philistines gathered for war, and they're encamping between Shocho and Azekah in the Ephes Damim. Saul is also camped and assembled in the valley of Terebinth and set in the battle array. So they basically are ready for a pitched battle. Now, what's happening here is that the Philistines have this incredibly mighty warrior named Goliath, and he's got this idea of taunting the Israelites and basically telling them, why don't you come and fight me, and whoever you send to duel with me, the winner will determine the victory for the entire battle. So if I win, you all become slaves, and if I lose, then my people all become slaves. So for 40 days, he does this. Now, the war has been going on for some time, and Jesse, father of David and the others, is now starting to wonder how his sons are doing, because 3 of his sons are in the army with Saul. So he tells David, go and check on my boys and bring these gifts as well, and why don't you tell me how the war is going? So David goes, and he meets with the people there, and as it says, the Philistine once again presents himself, so Goliath resumes his daily taunting, and at this point now, David is hearing about all this, and he's saying, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that is saying these things to the people Israel, God's people? And the people are telling him, oh, well, the king said whoever can kill this guy is going to get riches, his daughter, and his family will be made free. So I do want to make a point here. His father's house will be made free in Israel, right? So essentially, this means free of taxation, I presume, as well as free of the expectation of giving soldiers. The king is master over all of Israel. So what would happen is everybody is the king's slave, essentially. They all serve the king. And it says routinely that Saul has a tendency to call upon people, say, come here. I want this guy, I want that guy. Oh, he's capable, give him to me. And taxation and gifts and things like this. So what's going to happen is whoever pulls this off is going to be free of those social obligations to pay the king. That is the bounty. You'll become a free citizen, not bound by the king's will. That is my interpretation of what it means to be a free house in Israel. And so David is now basically saying, so what happens to the person who kills this guy? And they confirm, like, that's what happens. That's what the king says. And then Eliab, his older brother, hears this, and he basically accuses David of coming down here to look at the war because he's a wicked person on the inside. Now, David says, what have I even done? Is it not but a word? So all he's done is talk, and yet he's being accused of something. And it's also messed up because his brother says, with whom have you left those few sheep? I know your impetuousness, blah, blah, blah. He's here because his father sent him here, and yet his brother is doubting him. And what's really important here is that this shows us exactly what kind of person Eliab was. Remember that when Samuel was looking at the different brothers, he saw Eliab and he thought, oh, it must be this guy. And God said, no, it's about what's on his heart, not what he looks like. And now we get to see this is Eliab's heart. So when he says to him, what does he say to him? I know your impetuousness and the evil of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the war. Boy, he's talking about the heart of the one whose heart is after God, the one who God's chosen. Eliab, ooh, you've really blown it on this one, guy. So anyway, he asks him the simple question, what have I done but a word? And sure enough, he turned around from him toward another, and he spoke according to the same, and the people answered according to the former manner. So it seems that he's basically getting his confirmations. And so the words which David had spoken were heard. And so basically, the people heard this, and they told Saul. And Saul says, hey, come here, kid. Come here. And David tells the king, look, don't let any person be afraid over that guy. I'll go and do it. Send me in. Put me in, coach. And Saul says, I can't send you in, you're just a kid. And he's been a warrior since he was a child. And David says to him, I was a shepherd of sheep. Here's a miracle that happened with me, okay? My sheep were attacked by a lion and a bear. They took one of my lambs, I went out after it, and I saved the lamb, and I killed the animal that was attacking. So both the lion and the bear have been laid low by my hand. The same will be true about this Philistine, because he taunted the armies of the living God. He says, the Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine. And so Saul, he understands what he's saying. He's accepting the terms, and he says, go and may the Lord be with you. So he lets it happen. Now, it says Saul dressed David with his garments, and he placed a copper helmet on his head, and he dressed him with a coat of mail. Now, it's very interesting. I've heard this said before, so I am a little guilty of bringing this up. Normally, you'd think, oh, well, him putting David in armor is very normal. But what's actually interesting, someone pointed out, it says he dressed David with his garments. And he placed a copper helmet on his head and dressed him with a coat of mail. In other words, he dressed up David to look like the king. This means the glory of the battle would be for the king if David were to win. Nevertheless, David says, I can't wear this. I'm not used to wearing this kind of outfit, so I can't wear them. So he takes them off. And he says, he's got his sword over his garments, right? And he's just, I got to take this off. So instead, he takes his staff and he takes some pebbles. And he goes with his little bag, and the shepherd is going out to the battlefield. And he draws near the Philistine Goliath, and Goliath looks at him and just hates him. I think he's insulted because they're sending me a child. This pretty boy is supposed to be my opponent. And he says, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? As in, like, where's your sword? And so David says to him, first Goliath says, come to me, I will give your flesh to the fowl of the air and the cattle of the field. David says to him in response, you come to me with sword, spear, and javelin. I come to you with God on my side, which you have taunted, by the way. So, the armies that you've been taunting, well, I'm fighting on behalf of that God, of their army. So what's going to happen is this. God is going to deliver you into my hand, and I'm going to kill you, I'm going to cut off your head, and then I'm going to feed the carcasses of your entire people, these Philistines in the camp, I'm going to feed them to the birds and the beasts. How do you like them apples? So, all the earth will know that Israel has a God. And all the assembly will know that not with sword and javelin does the Lord save, but rather the battle is the Lord's. He will deliver you into our hand. Now, this is so important, right? Because we've seen many instances where the numbers are not adding up in favor of the smaller side, yet God delivers the smaller side of victory, and this is another one of those cases. It's against all odds, a miracle will take place. And so it says, the Philistine arises and draws near. And I also want to point out that Goliath had a shield bearer. So it's interesting that he had somebody with him. But basically the duel begins and Goliath draws near. And then David also goes in for battle. He reaches into his bag, shoots a stone at Goliath, hits him in the forehead, and kills him instantly. So he drops dead. Then he takes the sword from Goliath, and he uses Goliath's own sword to decapitate Goliath. And then, before everybody of the two camps, they see this just happen. Now the Philistines are freaking out. They start running. And everybody, it says, the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines until you come to the valley and until the gates of Ekron. So basically they chased them down, and they beat them up. They killed them. They plundered. And at this, David takes the head of Goliath, brings it to Jerusalem, and his weapons he put in his tent. So he took the spoils of war, he took them home with him, and as he says, Saul looks at him, and he says, "Whose son is this youth, Abner?" He's asking his general, and the general's like, "I don't know. I got no idea who this is." And he says, Go ask who that is. And they ask, and basically, they find out, I'm David, son of your bondsman Jesse the Bethlehemite. So he doesn't even say, I'm David. He says, the son of your bondsman Jesse the Bethlehemite. Now, I want to make a point here. Why is it that Saul does not recognize his own weapon bearer and music boy? Well, it's probably because the way he just presented himself before everybody, he looked like a totally different person. And this is a very, very important moment. This is hugely important because this is everything. This is everything that proves in this moment that David has received the blessing, the mandate of heaven. When Saul was doing prophecy with the holy men, they said, is that the son of Kish? They didn't recognize him. Is he the son of Kish? The same thing has now happened, and Saul doesn't even necessarily realize it. People are looking at David, and they're like, whose son is that? They don't even recognize him, even though they know him. That is the power of this transformation with the Spirit of the Lord upon him and the manifestation of that great power. That concludes chapter 17. Let's move on to chapter 18, verse 1. And it was, as he finished speaking to Saul, that Jonathan's soul had become attached to David's soul, and Jonathan loved him as himself. And Saul took him on that day, and did not allow him to return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan stripped himself of the cloak which was on him, and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword, and even to his bow, and even to his girdle. And David went out. Wherever Saul would send him, he would succeed. Accordingly, Saul appointed him over the soldiers, and he was pleasing in the eyes of all the people, and also in the eyes of Saul's servants. And it was when David returned from slaying the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel to sing, and with musical instruments in their hands, toward King Saul with drums, with joy, and with cymbals. And the cheering women sang out loud and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very chagrined, and the matter displeased him. And he said, They ascribe to David 10,000s, and to me they ascribe the thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. And it was on the morrow that the evil spirit from God rested upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of his house. And David was playing with his hand like every day, and the spear was in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the spear and said, I shall pin David to the wall. And David turned from before him twice. And Saul feared David, for the Lord was with him, while he had turned away from Saul. And Saul removed him from being with him, and made him for himself a captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David was successful in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. And Saul saw that he was very successful, and he feared him. And all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. And Saul said to David, Behold, my elder daughter Merab, I shall give her to you as a wife. But be a warrior for me, and wage the wars of the Lord. For Saul said, Let not my hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said to Saul, Who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be a son-in-law to the king? And it was at the time that Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Meholotite, as a wife. And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said,
I shall give her to him, and she will be a snare to him, and the hand of the Philistines will be upon him.
And Saul said to David,
With one of two shall you be my son-in-law today.
And Saul commanded his servants,
Speak to David secretly, telling, Behold, the king desires you, and all his servants love you. And now become the king's son-in-law.
And Saul's servants spoke these words in David's ears. And David said, Does becoming the king's son-in-law seem to you to be a light thing? For I am poor and lightly esteemed. And Saul's servants told him, saying, According to these words has David spoken.
And Saul said, So shall you say to David, The king has no desire in a dowry, but in 100 foreskins of Philistines to avenge himself upon the king's enemies.
But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And his servants told David these words, and the thing pleased David to become the king's son-in-law, and the days had not expired. And David arose, and he and his men went, and he slew 200 men of the Philistines, and brought their foreskins, and they delivered them in full to the king, in order to become the king's son-in-law, and the king gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. And Saul saw, and knew that the Lord was with David, and Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul grew still more afraid of David, and Saul was hostile to David all the days. And the princes of the Philistines came out, and it was, as often as they came out, that David was much more successful than all Saul's servants, and his name was highly esteemed. End of chapter 18. So once again, our usual recap. So here we see that immediately after the situation with David and Goliath, it first says that Jonathan's soul had become attached to David's soul. So they become like brothers on a spiritual level. And he realizes that Jonathan loves David as much as himself. So he basically, from this day forward, they're now soul brothers. Now Saul takes David into his home from this day forth, and Jonathan makes a covenant with David because of how much he loves him. And he takes off all of his nice garments, so his cloak, his sword, his bow, his girdle, all of his great things, he takes them off and gives them to David. And so it says whenever David would go out, he would succeed. And so he would appoint him over the soldiers, and sure enough, everybody loved him for it. Now, the problem was that when they came back, it says, when David returned from slaying the Philistine, the women came out of the cities of Israel, and they all started singing, basically, Saul slays thousands, David slays 10,000s. And this makes Saul very upset, because they have just discredited his own glory in battle over the years and said that David's better than him. So it basically outlines very clearly, this makes him angry. And he says, they ascribe David 10,000s and me thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? So in other words, what else is there for him to but be declared the king as well? He's already taken everything else from me glory-wise. And so from that day on, he has an eye on David. Like he's got a bad, evil eye on him. Now, as it happens that the evil spirit is once again torturing Saul, David is playing the harp, and Saul takes a spear and throws it, saying he'll pin David to the wall. And David just turns from before him twice. So David's basically playing da 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 da, and he turns around, and Saul is unable to hurt him. And this makes Saul terrified of David because he realizes that God is behind him. And not only that, but God has abandoned himself. So God has abandoned Saul and is now with David. This is what Saul realizes, and it's terrifying. So he gets him out of his sight, and he basically says, okay, from now on, you're a captain over the soldiers. Sure enough, David continues to be successful in battle. And it says that all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. Also, a note here, I finally have put the dots together in my head why it's always separating Judah from Israel. I think this is just because of this could be where they have the capital and everything. So just like they'll say, all of Persia and Susa loved whatever, like they say the capital place as well. That's one explanation. I'm still not satisfied with this. I don't like the distinction of Judah from Israel, though in this case, at least now, we're dealing with the right tribe as far as David's tribe being Judah. But anyway, what happens next is Saul says, behold my elder daughter Merab, I shall give her to you as a wife. And sure enough, and he says, just go and wage war for me. on behalf of God. And in his mind, he's really thinking, the Philistines will get rid of David for me. I don't have to worry about it. And David says, oh, who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel that I should be a son-in-law? Very humble. He's basically saying, I'm a nobody. What do you mean making me the son-in-law to the king? That's amazing. So at this time, they instead find that Saul's daughter Merab is instead given to Adriel, not David. It says a Meholathite. So he's either married to an Israelite from the Meholathite line or a foreigner, and this is like some sort of foreign domestic policy situation. But anyway, instead it says that Michal, Saul's daughter, loves David. So now this is the real deal. Before it was, hey, I'll give you my daughter Merab. But then we could see that this woman, who is the younger sister, actually loves David herself, and they find that out. They tell Saul, and he's like, oh yes, very good. I'm going to take advantage of this. So she'll be a snare to him, and then the Philistines will kill him. Perfect. All according to plan. And so he says, with one of two shall you be my son-in-law today. It says one of in parentheses, so maybe that's literally or something, or like a modified translation, but basically you'll be my son-in-law through one of my daughters. Now, I want to make an interesting point here about this. This very much reminds me of none other than Lavan, the Aramean. Right? This is the uncle of Jacob, a.k.a. Israel, who had Jacob working for him for 7 years and then another 7 years because he pulled a switcheroo. So, sure enough, that was what happened here. The king says, let me give you my daughter Merab, and then he actually says, no, I'm giving her to someone else. But in this case, that's different. Like Jacob got both women, but here he basically doesn't give David the girl. The second time around, he's going to give her the girl. So it's very similar. The other thing that's very similar is that Saul, much like Laban, is very jealous of David. This relationship is very similar to what happened with Jacob and Laban. So nevertheless, all this scheming to make him fail only makes him succeed even more. Everybody's seeing him come and go out of the field of battle. They see him leaving with the army, coming back with the army. This is making him hugely popular. So what do you think is going to happen? This is just making David even greater. You're a fool, Saul. You're a fool. The best thing you could do is nothing to the guy. Just leave him alone. But by trying to make him fail, you're setting him up for success. So in any case, he's planning to give Michal over, and hopefully the Philistines are totally going to pull this off this time, right? So he says, tell David that my daughter is going to, I want him to be with my daughter, and I want you to be my son-in-law, and behold, I desire you, and all my servants love you, so yeah, come be my son-in-law. And David once again says very humbly, does this seem like it's a small thing? I'm poor. I come from nothing. I'm not fit to be the son-in-law of the king. And so Saul tells him, listen, I'm not worried about a dowry, because this is part of the issue, him saying I'm poor. Like, what is he going to give in exchange for the wife? Well, the king says, I don't need a dowry. I need 100 foreskins from the Philistines. In other words, go to war for me again and avenge me of my enemies. And that's how you're going to get my daughter. And of course, he's thinking to himself, David's totally going to die this time for sure. Not only does he not die, he comes back thrilled because he gets to get not just 100, but 200 foreskins delivered, all 2-for-1 special, money back guarantee. He's got this daughter now added as a wife. So David secures the romance with Michal. She loves him. And Saul can see very clearly that the Lord is with this guy, and it just makes him even more and more afraid of him, and also more and more bitter and hostile toward him. And it says, the princes of the Philistines came out, and it was, as often as they came out, that David was more successful than all Saul's servants, and his name was highly esteemed. As the Philistines continued to wage war, so too did David's esteem grow in kind. So there we have it. That's the end for this week. Incredible turn of events. Again, bitterness and madness drive someone to do bad things. And then, of course, his enmity and hatred and jealousy are all part of the plan. Saul has been cast out of glory, but still holds the throne and wishes to get rid of David. He cannot succeed because God is on his side. So this is the living proof of God's power. And David is, of course, one of a perfect heart for God, as is why he was able to overcome all these obstacles thus far. His heart was purely one with God, and thus God chose him. That's all for this week's episode. Thanks for tuning in to the Weekly Parashahcast, and I hope you'll tune in next time as we continue the book of Samuel. Until then, as always, this has been Shmuel Moshe saying, thanks for listening, and as always, Baruch Hashem.